So welcome to the Blue Deal debate. And this time we're going to be looking at the big picture. Our seas, our oceans, our fishing industry, the marine environment across the entire globe. I'm Chris Davis, and this webinar is taking place thanks to the organisation support of consultancy Rud Pedersen in Brussels. The world's oceans, what's being done or not being done to curb overfishing on the high seas and to ensure that the future is sustainable for fish and for the fishing industry. With me, I welcome Anders Jessen, top right of the screen, the European Commission's head of units and chief representative on a good few of the RFMOs around the globe. That's regional fisheries management organizations. Dialing in from Washington, we have Amanda Nickson, International Fisheries Director with the Pew Charitable Trusts. Thank you, Amanda. I know it's early there, and thank you for calling me in the middle of the night just to check what time we actually started. It wasn't too disrupted. And from Finland, we have Camiel Derichs, Program Director, that's sort of advanced planner, I suppose, for the Marine Stewardship Council, the organisation that more than any other certifies whether a fishery really is being managed sustainbly. And Camiel, I'm told you started off as a banker until you discovered that the future is fish. So
I'll make a quick introduction. That was my history. I'm an economist in background, worked in banking, but then soon figured out that wasn't my future. So I quit my job and in my early 20s went to Norway, studied fishery science, and from that second master's I moved into working for the MSc in a diverse number of roles. And then
you've been there a good while now. Yeah. Well, yes, I'm expecting a lively discussion here, and I'm also expecting to learn a lot because I know very little about how the high seas are governed and what needs to be done. If anyone watching here wants to submit a question, then there's a comment box on the right-hand side of your screen, and you can do that. And I'm pleased to tell you that our guests here have agreed to stay on for half an hour at the end of the programme so we can specifically look at some of the questions that have been submitted. So thank you very much indeed. Let's make an immediate start and get down to basics. I mean, what's the scale of is there a problem here? What is the scale of the problem if it exists? Because virus or no virus, there are an extra 200,000 people on the planet every single day, and they need feeding, they need food, they need fish in the seas. Back in 2002, Johannesburg, the World Summit on Sustainable Development, we globally made a commitment to be fishing sustainably by 2015 everywhere. Is that happening? Let's start with Amanda. Amanda, tell us, what's the picture like? Are we overfishing?
The picture is, in fact, unfortunately not good at all, and overfishing is still the largest threat to the oceans alongside climate change. And in fact, the trend is particularly worrying because the number of stocks that are being fished within sustainability kind of parameters has decreased over time from 90% in 1974 to only about 67% in 2015. And the percentage of stocks that are considered to be overfished has increased over time as well. So sadly, we are still not sending the trend in the right direction for the ocean's fish stocks. Question really is
67%, well, 33% therefore being overfished? I mean, in the European Union, the picture was even worse just 10 years ago when we were overfishing 70, 80% of our fish, and yet within a relatively short period of time, we're achieving maximum sustainable yield. So it's not an irreversible position.
The good thing about fish stock management is that you can actually fix much of the problem. What's disturbing, however, is that we're not seeing that happen nearly quickly enough, and the trend at an international level certainly isn't heading in the right direction yet. And while we can say that only one third is still a very high proportion is considered to be overfished, there's another 60% or so that are absolutely at the maximum of what you can fish sustainably. So we're talking really more about 2/3 overall that we need to be expressing some concern about. And when we consider the ever-growing global population and the importance of fish not only to our food supply but also to the health of the planet because of their role within the oceans and the role of the oceans in our planetary health, then you have to look at this and say this is not happening anywhere near fast enough in terms of improvements in overall governance and management.
So Anders, does the European Commission share those concerns? Anders. Okay. I think our technical people will have to find out what the problem with Anders is, because he clearly can't hear what I'm saying. But turn to Marine Stewardship Council. Camiel, again, do you share those concerns about overfishing?
Yes, I do. I think what Amanda said is spot on. 33% of fish stocks being overfished, according to the FAO, is simply 33% too much. And we need to turn the tide for those stocks. And in the context where we head towards perhaps 9 billion people, maybe even 10 billion people by 2050, we need all stocks to be managed sustainable, just to assure food security and to make sure that people in the future can continue to fish those stocks for jobs. So for me, it is absolutely clear that we need to do a better job on fisheries management, and we need to do that faster. Putting this in the broader context of climate change, pollution, and other pressures that the oceans have to cope with, this is an urgent matter that we need to address globally.
Anders, are you with us again?
I am. I was
okay.
on, but I didn't realize I had only part of the screen. So yes, I'm with you. Sorry about that.
So we're just discussing overfishing, and Amanda from Pew Charitable Trusts has said that to be overfishing more than a third of the world's seas is clearly, and with the trend still downwards, is a situation of some concern. Is that shared by the European Commission?
Yes, 33% is too high. But I think, you have to look at it in a slightly more detailed perspective, because you have to look at where the problems are occurring, because there are places of the world where actually management of fish stocks works reasonably well, and there are areas where it's clearly not working well enough. And if, for example, if you look at the last, I think 2018 report by the FAO on the state of fisheries, it is clear that one of the key challenges that we're facing at the moment is as developing countries are trying to develop their fleets and develop their fisheries, that in certain parts of the world are putting huge pressures on fish stocks. And that is one of the challenges that we have to cope with.
Have we actually peaked now? Have we actually caught, have we passed the point of the maximum number of fish being caught simply because we're overfishing and there were fewer fish left in the sea? And as you say, the pressure is still building up because a number of countries are trying to build up their fishing fleets, even though there may be less fish in the sea, and therefore making the situation worse. Have we, Amanda, or can I put that question to any of you? Have we actually, are we now overfishing to the point that the fish stocks globally are going down?
I think it's difficult to say, because fish stocks, as you know, you can't count every single fish. But what we do know is that overall the trends tell us that it would be very, very difficult to catch more fish without having a fundamentally negative impact on the various different age classes in any given population, firstly. Secondly, we know we have ever improving technology that allows us to chase these fish as a human race with ever more kind of veracity and accuracy. And the issue, to my mind, isn't really, can we catch any more? It's how do we ensure that the amount that we're taking out of the ocean is, in fact, sustainable in terms of ocean health. And at the moment, when we talk about management in an international context, we know that most of the regional fisheries management organizations don't have forward-thinking, science-based plans in place for this. They may have committed to putting what we call harvest strategies in place, but it isn't happening fast enough. And in the meantime, we're seeing this continued trend of more and more stocks being either on the brink of overfishing or heading into already being defined as overfished. So from our perspective, as I said at the beginning, this just isn't happening fast enough, and I don't think that we can look at it and say that that we're in any safe position with respect to the future management of fish stocks just yet.
Some of the figures are horrendous. For the big species like sharks, for example, swordfish, seeing some figures were saying 90% of all the sharks have disappeared. These, 90%, and yet you still see wildlife films and the like, which suggests there's plenty of sharks out there.
Well, you have a whole lot of different shark species to begin with, so you're not necessarily going to see the same impacts by different species groups. But If you look at it,
so Amanda's frozen from Washington.
Shark species
Okay.
in real trouble and multiple fish species in real trouble, then yes. And the question you have to ask yourself isn't what. Have I unfrozen now?
No, you're coming and going. So let me.
Nope.
I think with you with the message, and there's I think you'll be able to point out that it's not all bad news. That in some cases, action, for example, on tuna has stabilised the situation, or we are fishing.
Yeah, no, I was also, if you allow me, was going to go back to your previous question as well, in terms of can we fish more? I think I would agree to some extent with what Amanda said, with one qualification. As you look at it now, the answer is, as Amanda said, no. But for those areas where we're not currently at MSY level, we are.
MSY is sustainable.
Yeah,
not overfishing.
Yield. We are by implication, because we fished too much in the past, the stocks are below a level that allows us to achieve MSY. So until you have rebuilt those stocks, but if you manage to rebuild the stocks, you will be able, and the example I was going to give you, because you were looking for, is there positive stories out there? There are stories as Eastern Bluefin tuna, which was in dire straits about 10, 12 years ago, and where we 2 years ago were able to finally move away from a recovery plan, and in fact, ahead of time, to a management plan, because the stock has come back. It's now coming back in northern parts of Europe, where they haven't seen it for the last 10 years. So it can be done if you put your minds together and you put the measures in place that you need in order to restore the stocks.
Yeah, well, this is the good news which Amanda referred to. This is a fixable problem.
It is, but I would sound a word of caution here, because this is one of those ones where my concern is that sometimes the views that are shared are just a little too rosy. In response to really very early signs of recovery, and before the scientists could even be clear that we were looking at a level of recovery, and the last time they checked, they were unable to confirm that, there was an agreement by managers to increase the quota by 170%. Now, that is not a modest or reasonable way to go around looking at fish stock recovery. So while we can tell from the Eastern Atlantic bluefin situation that if you follow the science, you will see signs of recovery, we cannot, this early in the piece, hold that up and say this is great. And before anyone says, NGOs always say that, we wanted to. We're all about wanting to say, great job on Atlantic bluefin and on these other stocks. But our concern is every single time there is just a glimmer of hope around these things, we see the short-term economic interests and desire for higher quota overtake sensible long-term management. And that remains the single biggest challenge with international fisheries governance.
Well, you mentioned governance, so let's please, Andy. Okay, please.
Yeah, no, just a quick reaction, because the figure of how much you increase is not in itself a telling indicator of whether it's being managed properly or not. The quotas that were set for Eastern Bluefin tuna was based on scientific advice. It was the numbers the scientists had given us that were used as the benchmark. We didn't sort of invent those figures. They came exactly from the science.
Well,
and
in fact, the science just indicated
at a time, and they're being reviewed each year by the scientists whether it's still sustainable.
Well, actually, no, because the scientists predicted that the currently adopted quota would lead to stock decline. So the notion that it could be increased by 170% and the stock remain acceptably heading in the right direction is inaccurate, according to ACAT's own scientists. So once again, I think we have to be very careful about what constitutes measured, moderate, and appropriate quota raises.
Okay, let's be careful.
Can I make one comment here on actually stocks heading in the right direction? Stocks fluctuate in nature. They go up and down, irrespective of human impact. So stocks will go in a wrong direction also if there's no fishing from time to time. And I guess that science-based decision-making is the basis for what management ought to do. I will not comment on bluefin tuna. There is no MSC certified bluefin tuna. There are some fisheries in assessment at the moment, and we will see what comes out of those assessments. But suffice to say that when it comes to stocks heading the right direction, you can have a perfectly well-managed, sustainable operation with stocks going in temporarily wrong direction before it turns up again after managers perhaps reduce fishing mortality for a while to allow the stock to recover. Just want to sketch that nuance.
Thanks, Camiel.
I think while that's important, I think while that's important, what we see far too often, and I'm sorry, Camiel, but what we see far too often is arguments like that used as a reason to allow inappropriate levels of fishing. And I will return once again to the central question here about whether or not we're seeing high seas management go in the right direction, and the role of the European Union. And I'll say on this one that I think one of the great things the European Union could do is to continue to support the rollout of harvest strategies in other places. As we've seen the EU take a multi-year approach to addressing illegal fishing through application of regulation, which has been one of the global forces for good, I believe, in the last number of years, we'd like to see the same thing happen. I would really caution against the kind of arguments that say, oh, because of fluctuations, we can raise quotas. I think that's very dangerous.
Okay, Amanda, you can explain a bit of that later. Let's get on to this issue of governance, though. We're not talking about all the seas, of course, because coastal states under the law of the seas have a 200-mile limit, and that's the area they're supposed to supervise. I think, but we're talking here, I think, about the high seas, are we not? And that's what, about half the world's oceans, and this is what I want to discuss. We have regional fisheries management organizations, I think, which cover all this area. But Anders, perhaps you can explain, how do these things work? How many are there? What are the arrangements? Who governs? Is it the Wild West out there? Where's the sheriff?
It's not the Wild West, except for certain parts. There are certain parts of the ocean that are still not covered. And when you look again at which areas where there's I would highlight the 3 areas in the world really where there's the Southeast Pacific, there is the Southwest Atlantic, and there's the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. In the Southwest Atlantic, you don't have RFMOs. We have tried, as last time I think the EU approached a number of the key players in regional coastal states about setting up an RFMO for that area of the world, and there's still no appetite, and it's not because we are not interested in it, we've been pushing for it. So just to answer your question, so if you talk about regional fisheries bodies, there are actually 2 types. You have the overall categories, regional fisheries bodies, but most of them are advisory, so they don't actually take binding measures. What you're referring to is what's called the RFMO, regional fisheries management organizations. They're the ones who actually take binding conservation and management measures. They have compliance mechanisms, they do science, they do IUU, etc. So those are the ones that really have a bite, and we are active in most of those, not every single one, a couple where we're not in, and we are trying to become members of a couple more. And for those who have only an advisory body, there are 2 of them that we're actually trying to upgrade to make them to proper fisheries management organizations. So it is part of our agenda to try to increase the reach and scope of these regional fisheries management organizations and make them more well equipped to deal with the challenges they face.
But of course, you understand the criticisms, and that is that you need a consensus, I think, of dozens of different countries in order to make progress, in order to set standards. And even when you do that, it's up to individual countries to enforce the rules on their own fishing fleets. And frankly, we've got to be suspicious about, well, in some cases, they have no capability. They simply are too poor, perhaps, to check properly. In other cases, well, one has to be suspicious of the figures that are then fed into the statistical process. I mean, if that were not the case, if it weren't the case that some governments cheat, we presumably would have been able to clamp down on illegal fisheries across the world decades ago.
Is that for me?
Yeah, well, I think, I'm afraid so, Anders. You're the one that has to sit. You're the one that has to sit in these meetings, and around you are people saying things. We're going to do this and doing that, and you know full well they're not going to do this or that.
No, but that's
why am I being unfair?
That's why you have in the regional fisheries management, you have a compliance process where you do look at cases where there are, signs of lack of proper enforcement or IUU activities, and that gets examined case by case, and the vessels are listed if you have found that they've engaged in IUU activities. I think we have now something more than almost 200 vessels that are listed. What we're trying to do now is make sure that these listings become what we call cross-listed. So if you list them in one RFMO, they're actually also listed in other. So we don't have these vessels just saying, okay, now we can't fish in this particular area because we've been caught out. So we're going to move somewhere else and re-engage in illegal activity. So
are we? Amanda made reference to the science. It's supposed to be science-based, evidence-led. So we have got fishery scientists assessing all these stocks globally, have we? Is that the case?
Yes. I mean, for the ones who, I mean, most relevant RFMOs, you have scientific bodies. In the EU, again, in order to say what the EU is doing, we are by far the biggest provider of scientists for these organizations in order to, ensure the expertise is there. We also by far the biggest funder of the science efforts that's taking place within the RFMOs. So many of the RFMOs, if you look at the actual funding that's being provided, whether in particular what's called voluntary contributions, the EU is by far the biggest funder of scientific activities in the RFMOs.
So can I jump in here for a moment, Chris? I have to acknowledge that's absolutely true, Anders, and the EU has a significant history of putting significant funds into those operations around the place. I would note as well that ICCAT is really the only one of the RFMOs that has anything approaching a robust compliance mechanism at the moment. And one of the things that's
ICCAT is the Atlantic tuna fisheries?
Yes, the Atlantic one. The others, most of the others don't. And this is, I think the Commission for Southern Bluefin also has a pretty good compliance mechanism. But certainly one of the things that goes alongside this idea of science-based forward-looking harvest strategies is how do you make sure that people are actually following those rules? And when we talk about illegal fishing, sometimes it's not happening with a country per se, it's members of a fleet within a country. And the technology is all now available to actually put better enforcement in place. But in the case of RFMOs, most of them do not have robust compliance mechanisms other than ICCAT and CCSBT in the Southern Ocean. And I think that is also one where the EU has the opportunity to really help push that forward, given that they do spend such a significant amount of money within the RFMOs on science and other issues.
I suppose.
Can I add to that, Chris?
Yeah, can I just one question just before Anders, and then I want to bring you in, Camiel. Just to what extent, when you're sitting around the table with 30 representatives of 30 other governmental bodies, how confident are you that the other people around the table are as committed as you are, as the European Union is, to try and ensure that we are fishing sustainably?
It depends on where you're sitting, which RFMOs. There are RFMOs, as I said, if you can look around the world, where are the problem areas? I mentioned the three of them. One actually doesn't have an RFMO, which is, in our view, part of the problem because there's no management organization to manage those stocks. That's the Southwest Atlantic. But for the rest of them, and I disagree, by the way, with what Amanda said about the compliance mechanisms. You just mentioned NIAF, and you have also NAFO, just to mention two others. You have an IATC, you have an IOTC, so the list goes on. There is compliance mechanism, the IUU listing, etc., in a lot more than just ICCAT. It's true ICCAT is the biggest and probably one of the ones that weigh the heaviest, but it doesn't mean that there's no compliance mechanism elsewhere. But you have to face the reality when you're sitting down with a very diverse group of countries that deprioritization, in particular when you have countries that have resource constraints for trying to develop their fisheries fleets, etc., or may have different priorities and different means than you have. And that's why we also acknowledge that by contributing, for example, to capacity building and meeting participation for developing countries. We, again, in an area where we're one of the biggest contributors to ensure that developing countries are capable and able to send their scientists or other to meetings, because that would be a challenge for them otherwise, because they don't have the financial means often to attend.
Camiel, the Marine Stewardship Council, I think you're certifying about 15% of global fish stocks as sustainable at the moment. Obviously, ensuring that compliance is taking place is absolutely essential. I mean, your whole system will fall apart if you can't ensure that those who have got these certificates are following the rules.
That's correct. Before I comment on how compliance is assessed in an MSC evaluation, maybe first to to go back to, say, RFMO compliance mechanisms that can be strengthened, with which I agree. I would like to add one more thing when we talk about international ocean governance, where the international governance framework is lacking, which was specifically mentioned also in the recent report issued by the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, which issued a report in September of last year, in which it recognized that the current governance framework is not fit to cope with the climate change future that is heading our way. And they specifically singled out the mackerel stock in the Northeast Atlantic, where the EU, Norway, Iceland, the Faroes, and other states target the same stock, which has shifted its distribution, but currently haven't found an agreement to allocate that stock across the different fishing states, leading to overall a higher fishing mortality than what is recommended by science. That is one example, and it showcases essentially that the international governance framework needs to be strengthened with some sort of, say, quantitative allocation mechanism beyond what is now embedded in the law of the sea of the fish stock agreement. So that's what I wanted to add, because I think that's a really core ingredient of what is currently missing in international oceans governance. Coming back to the MSC point, yes, about 15% of global catch is currently assessed and certified against the MSC standard. 85% is not. That's where most of the improvements probably can be made. Those fisheries that are certified have all been tested in the same transparent, evidence and science-based manner against the standard, and compliance with regulation is a key component of that. There's a specific, what we call performance indicator, set of criteria that is being tested, and essentially the auditing team will look at the mechanisms in place to ensure that fisheries follow the law. If there is evidence of non-compliance, fisheries, if that is not systematic, may still be passing with a requirement to, within a certain time frame, make improvements. And those improvements then have to be delivered within the time frame of the certificate. But if there's some systematic non-compliance, then these fisheries will not pass. And that means that they first need to improve their compliance systems before they can enter the MSC program.
Okay, and there's, okay, the MSC may be the gold star or the silver star anyway, for certification and for sustainability, but you're trying to bring about improvements of the management in general. I mean, what sort of improvements, changes do you want to see in the RFMOs, these regional management organizations, to make them more effective and to ensure that they are listening to the scientists and putting the recommendations into practice, enforcing the rules?
Well, one of the things that we have been a big promoter of is what we call performance reviews. So, which actually is quite unique for the RFMOs. I'm not sure how many other international organizations actually subject themselves to performance reviews by independent experts. Most of the RFMOs, at least the main ones, let's talk about the main ones, the 19-20 main ones, have undergone this performance review. We get external experts go through and compare how is the RFMA performing compared to their objectives as set out in their conventions. And that is often where we look for inspiration in terms of upgrading the different RFMOs. It can be, in some cases, that the constituent documents that created the organism is outdated. It doesn't reflect modern fishery science. It doesn't have a lot of the newer aspects you'd find in some of the newer organizations. So, but this is a very heavy process. For those who follow ICANN will know that it took us a long time to get in agreement on a new convention instrument. But that's one area where you need to have the basic core instruments up to date, so it reflects the latest state of thinking. And we want to see improved science. So again, more funding for science, better science available. We want, and that comes back to a point Amanda made earlier, we are also a big promoter of moving to harvest control strategies. Again, some of the work that's being done, funded mostly by EU, have been sponsored, but that is realistic in some organizations at the moment would have the scientific capacity. In others, it is a bit more of a challenge to move, but that's where we ultimately want to go. But it's not something you do overnight.
Let me throw a first question into you, and it's about yellowfin tuna in the Indian Ocean, and just saying, there's a letter here from scientists who are warning that within the next couple of years, there's a real danger that the yellowfin tuna stocks in that ocean could collapse. Are we pressing for the precautionary principle to be applied? Are we saying this is a real danger and we must take account of what some scientists are saying?
Yes, we have. Again, last year's annual meeting, the EU tabled a proposal which would have, if my memory serves me right, would have led to a reduction of 12% in yellowfin tuna catches. We didn't succeed, and it's not the first time we haven't succeeded. We have a similar problem at the moment, or had a similar problem in the Atlantic for tropical tuna, because you have conservation measures with binding elements only for certain fleets, typically the foreign fleets that operate in these, or long distance fleets, particularly big purse seiners, no restrictions for other types of gears, or very limited types of restrictions. And as a result, we have, for example, the European fleet has seen its catches reduced both in the Atlantic and in the Indian Ocean to no avail, because the other one catches simply offset. So we want to have a more comprehensive measure that covers all the different gears so you can get to the result you need. But as long as you exempt certain gear types from restrictions, you're not going to get the result we want.
So the scientists, I understand, are sort of saying we should be cutting the catches of yellowfin tuna by 25%. The EU pressed for 12%, and we couldn't even get that. I mean, it doesn't give you confidence that these RFMOs are doing what has to be done.
Let me. I think I'm familiar with the letter you're referring to, because the letter that we're referring to are scientists that are not members of the scientific body of IOTC. We follow the advice that was from the official scientific body in the IOTC. It's true there have been external scientists that have a different view, but we have one scientific body within the organization, and that's the one we rely. We don't go form shopping and say we better like the advice that's been given elsewhere. I think we'd be very much criticized, because sometimes that could be very convenient for us to go look for science that may perhaps suited some stakeholders a bit better than others. So we follow the scientific advice that is given by the scientific body set up by the RFMO.
Amanda, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I'd love to, actually. So I think that obviously the Indian Ocean yellowfin situation has some of its own challenges, not least of which is that at the moment, I believe the EU holds the largest portion of catch historically. And part of the challenge in negotiating in RFMOs is the use of data to determine allocations. And it's one of those things that actually makes it really tricky to determine how to get everyone signed up. And there is that great comment that's often made about decisions are made by those who show up. So when we talk about RFMOs and how they function, we have to look at the fact that we're talking about a number of players in a room kind of to come to some decisions. And I think so unfortunately for Anders, because he's in the hot seat for the EU at the moment, this is one where I think the EU has unfortunately had a difficult time dealing with the issue of should historical catch be used when you're looking at the emergence of developing nations. But I also just want to come on to another point around listening to the scientific advice, and Anders will be thrilled because this is before he became involved in the discussion that I mentioned, this particularly difficult one. But the EU doesn't always have a track record of following the advice. And I want to look particularly at big eye, where we knew in 2015 that there was a problem with the big eye stock in the Atlantic. And the EU's proposal was one that gave it less than a 50-50% chance of sending the stock back in the right direction, despite clear scientific advice that more catch cuts were needed. So I look forward to the EU actually taking a stronger position on this going forward, because I don't think that their track record on following the scientific advice is actually as good.
I think we got you. Okay, you've made your point, and at this point, I can announce that we are just past the halfway mark of this Blue Deal debate, which has been made possible thanks to the support of consultancy Wood Pedersen in Brussels, for which I'm enormously grateful, because they allow me to keep my brain active during this lockdown. And the webinar will be available to those of you who've registered, I'm told, immediately after it's over, and it will be available more generally on YouTube in the next day or so. If you want to be kept in the loop and to register for the whole series, of course you really should, because it's going to be fantastic. There's lots more interesting topics to discuss. But I'm told that thanks to the wonders of the technology, there'll be a button on the right-hand side which will allow you to do that. And you can also submit questions on the comment column here. And our panelists have agreed to stay on for half an hour after our end time to discuss the questions that have been submitted. So let's get back to the discussion about ocean governance and what can be done to curb overfishing and ensure that we're managing the world's high seas sustainably. And with me are Anders Jessen from the European Commission. We have Amanda Nickson from the Pew Charitable Trusts and Camiel Derichs from the Marine Stewardship Council. Camiel, I'm going to come on to you now. I mean, I've always liked Marine Stewardship Council. I liked its origin. I like the fact that a big fish processing company at the time, Unilever, I don't think it's doing fish now, but it was at the time, came together with a well-known NGO, WWF, and said, we want to be able to supply our customers with fish in 100 years' time. And the way we're going, there aren't going to be the fish there to put in the supermarkets. Hence the launch of Marine Stewardship Council. Here you are, nearly 25 years later, think you're certifying about 15% of the world's fish. Why aren't you certifying more, given the weaknesses of the RFMOs?
I guess 15% is an incredible amount of seafood being caught sustainably, having been tested independently through a public assessment process, science and evidence-based process, demonstrating sustainability. We would love to see many more fisheries in the program, obviously, but the reality is the MSC sets a testing bar. I mean, we've heard about the need to see international fisheries governance to make progress on adopting harvest strategies and harvest control rules. Well, that's a hard requirement in the MSC program. If fisheries don't deliver on that or don't have that in place, they are finding it very hard to get certified. Many stocks are overfished. 33% of the stocks in the world, according to the FAO, is overfished. MSC sets a high outcome indicator that if a stock is overfished, you simply cannot get certified. In other words, there is an incredible amount of fisheries out there that we hope can one day get certified, and we support fisheries around the world to make improvements. But so far it's only 15%. Looking at the improvement space, and that is maybe less well known about the MSC. Yes, we're a standard setter and we have an eco label, but a very big part of our activities actually sits before certification by working with fisheries well before they are meeting the MSC standards and helping them underway towards sustainability. So we build capacity with governments, with fisheries communities in many countries around the world, and for fisheries of all scales and sizes, small scale and big scale. And we offer action plan templates for these fisheries to fill out, and then with our scientists, government regulators to make improvements on. So these pathways projects, it's a less well-known aspect of the MSC program, is taking a vast amount of our effort and time to drive these improvements.
Okay, so you make people jump through hoops, and what's the benefit for them? Why do they, given that 85% of the fish being caught are not going through MSC, why do 15% bother with all this?
I think the reality is, well, if we split the global fish catch in what is typically considered to be subsistence use, local fisheries, small-scale subsistence fish in developing countries, representing about 50% of all catch, and 50% of the world's catch, which is then typically used for some sort of more international type of markets where maybe there's a demand for sustainability. 15% out of the global may then be 30% out of that, say, proportion that could be reached by the MSC program. So that's actually a very substantial part. And on top of that then comes an incredible body of fisheries that is working with NGO partners, scientists, governments, and supported by the MSC to make further progress towards one day meeting the MSC standard. Now, what is in it for these fisheries? There's many reasons mentioned by fisheries why they want to seek certification. Market arguments have been heard often. Some fisheries indeed get a modest price premium, some get a higher price premium, but it's not the only argument. Many fisheries actually want to see long-term sustainable management. They may want to ring-fence the number of licenses. They want to work and use the system, the MSC system, to work together with other stakeholders to drive improvements. They want to potentially drive improved science. They want to have reputational gains. So there's a whole suite of arguments and drivers that sits behind the desire for fisheries to get MSC certified.
So you work, I mean, it's easy to look at the pretty fishermen, if you like, the small specialist fishermen and say these are certified, and you pay a premium in the supermarket for buying those goods. But you also certify some of the, some of those that are not regarded as pretty. I think you certify some super trawlers, for example, in some cases.
Yeah.
So is that the case?
Yeah, absolutely. I think sustainability. Let me first start to say that small-scale fisheries, which have like passive gears, they typically have traits that make them easier to certify, but they also have traits that make them harder to certify. Many small-scale fisheries are data deficient. Very often, large fleets of small-scale vessels are harder to control, so the monitoring, compliance, and surveillance mechanisms may not be as robust. With a few large fisheries, that might be much easier to control. The MSC has a whole suite of different gears and participation from different countries in the program, irrespective of scale, irrespective of location. That's also actually a requirement from the FAO that we are open to all scales, and including very big fisheries. And those big fisheries, again, they can demonstrate they have high levels of stock, proper management in place, high levels of compliance, and they've taken mitigation measures to keep the fisheries and the ecosystem sustainable. So, yeah, I guess small can be beautiful, but big is not necessarily ugly, is what I'm saying.
Okay, all right. But you work, of course, with the big seafood companies, and we're talking about a business here which, what is it? Some of the biggest companies, Japanese, for example. We don't know. I don't think many people know their names, but they know the names of the brands on the cans of fish they see in the supermarket. But these Japanese companies, scores of subsidiaries and the like, big enterprises, billion-dollar turnovers. You work with these. I mean, why aren't they coming? Why isn't one of these big companies simply saying we want everything to be MSC certified? We want to. What are they doing themselves to take a lead? Because surely. Anders here working with the governments, and you've got to police the fishermen. You really want the people who buy the fish to be policing the fishermen, don't you? So because they've got the mother short and curly, so to speak. They've got the financial clout to say you will fish in this way, you will not overfish, you will follow the rules. Yeah,
it's fair to say. I mean, there are a select number of very large fishing processing companies. Companies that also very often supply directly into major retailers around the globe that have an incredible amount of impact on the world's fisheries. A couple of years back, a paper from the Stockholm Resilience Center, I believe, singled out a select number of major companies collectively, perhaps reaching about 25% of global fish catch. So it's a very, in that sense, concentrated industry, and these major companies, they probably can do a lot more than what they do today. And it's not just about very good policy and commitments on paper to have everything sustainable, but actually to demonstrate that independently verified, hopefully, that by a certain time, everything is indeed originating from well-managed sustainable stocks, is legal, and so forth and so on. So I actually think that many of these major companies need to act up a little bit. And don't get me wrong, we work with many of them and we really see them as partners in this journey, but it is almost like what Amanda said earlier about the urgency of improving international fisheries governance. It does require also an increased urgency and an acceleration of activity from these major companies. So it's not just governments, but indeed also these companies acting up and creating a more enabling environment in which the governments then can operate.
Can I jump in, Chris? So I think there is no doubt that where the MSC is now is different from where things were 20 years ago. And I think that it's important to note that a number of the concepts that we are seeing actively rise to the surface in terms of improvements in RFMO governance can be traced in no small part back to what the standard requires, including things like putting in place harvest control rules. Now, we need to take that a step further and actually see that not just happen in the context of an individual certification. We need to see in RFMOs that they adopt widespread comprehensive systems that take that to the next level. And I think one of the things that companies miss a lot of the time is that these absences in the RFMO governance system are costing them money because they have to go and find other ways to show consumers or buyers that the product that they are sourcing is in fact reasonable and sustainable. Now, we don't go to the supermarket and assume that we have to check that the soap powder that we got off the shelf is poisonous. We figure that the regulatory chain took care of that for us, and we choose it because we like the scent or we want one for sensitive skin or whatever. But when you go in and look at fish products, there is still a question in our minds that many consumers have and that can't be easily answered about whether or not these came from fundamentally well-managed sustainable sources. And the MSC is one of the first tools to actually enable consumers to see that. But when you start looking at ocean governance, we can't rely on the MSC as the only provider of that certainty. And at the moment, the RFMOs have huge gaps there, and they should be looking to fill those.
But Camiel's just said, Amanda, that the big fish processing companies should be stepping up to a greater degree. To what extent are you, Pew Charitable Trusts, a lot of influence? To what extent are you engaging with those companies to try and bring this about and to be working in partnership?
So we have a number of conversations through either industry coalitions or other kinds of engagement, and we provide a lot of educational seminars and things like that around how industry and retail players can come to understand some of the complexity, because as Anders and I well know, and as you've touched on, the complexity of those discussions when you're in an RFMO setting is something that takes some knowing. What I think the really important message that we try and give to industry players is you need to get in there and tell your representatives, tell your Anders in different countries that you want to see these things happen. Because at the moment, what we see is delegations dominated, and this is certainly true for the EU, by interests who are not saying that. And so when you have 120 industry members on a delegation telling you as the negotiator that they don't want a harvest strategy that limits their ability to fish, then it puts that negotiator in a very difficult position. We want to see industry saying to RFMO delegations, please go in and plug the holes in governance so that we have a stable, sustainable supply of fish coming through to market. And it's another reason why I would say that we think it's really important for the EU to include a more balanced group of stakeholders on their delegation so that we can help with things like that, because we can talk to industry, but we also want to be part of helping develop broader positions for governments going into NGOs.
So Anders,
sorry,
there was a dig at us there, so I think I need to react. I mean, we don't determine the composition of our delegations. The delegations are open to those that want to take part, and we don't pick and choose who sits on our delegation. Now, if you look at our delegation, I think that's often being presented as an element to show that our delegation is not balanced, is that for reasons which I can get into if we have the time, NGOs tend not to register with our delegation. The reason being, if they're part of the delegation, they're not allowed to speak at the meetings because they are advisors to us, and industry tends to register as part of our delegation. But it's not our choice. NGOs, if they wish to register as part of our delegation, can do it. So I don't want anybody to be left with the impression that it's our picking and choosing. It's simply the choice often of RFMOs not to register as part of our delegation. But the broader point, if I can come back to this, because I think by cutting all RFMOs, looking at them through the same lens is one element that I think makes it part of the problem very difficult to resolve. Because as I said, there are certain areas where there are problems, there are other areas where things are managed reasonably well. And I think in particular, the sort of takeaway message from events such as this one is that it's not functioning. That in itself does not help us get industry on board to take some of these measures, because, for example, I come back to the example of Eastern bluefin tuna, but there are others as well. Once we have success stories, if the only thing the industry afterwards is told is still you're not doing well enough, they disengage. We need them to also get recognition for they've actually played part of the game, they contributed to a solution, and that they get some recognition for that fact. That's the way to keep them engaged, keep them involved, and they're much more likely to accept the painful decisions that are needed sometimes in order to restore stocks if they get some recognition at the end of the process. If all they hear all the time is that it's just misery and everything is going terribly, they will not be looking for solutions in the way we need them to.
No.
So
Okay.
I could not agree more with this, but I'm going to respond to some of this as well. First is that we're really looking forward to hearing a yes to our participation in both NIAF and ICAT in future, because that hasn't happened to date. So we'll look forward to that from an NGO perspective. Secondly, I would say that NGOs are dying to give some good news around this stuff. And I think that we've touched on a number of issues around the role that the EU has played with respect to funding important work and stuff like that. But nor can we sit back at this point and say that it's acceptable to allow decisions that are not in line with scientific advice, for industry pressure to disallow setting of quotas where they should be, simply because they don't like it. It is the job of international fisheries governance to fix the issues and not to actually just say, well done, because you got halfway there. That is not how we're going to turn the tide of overfishing. And while it's difficult, as we said at the beginning, we've said from the get-go, this is a fixable problem. And we do see that there are things in place, but I do not believe, and nor do I think actually any of us on this call believe, that allowing overfishing to continue and saying, well done for getting part of the way there, is the way that we solve this problem. And it's time for all governments involved, and in fact, all of the industry, to step into that discussion and say, if we want to secure food and ocean health for the next 30, 40, 50, 100 years, we have got to stop this from happening now. And that's
Right.
just where we are.
I come back to the point about the establishment of the Marine Stewardship Council and the fact that it was a big fish processing company that worked with an NGO to take an initiative. So, Anders, are the fish processing companies, the big Japanese and other companies with their billion-dollar turnovers, are they approaching you and pushing, trying to encourage you to be more ambitious in bringing about improvements in the RFMOs? Or indeed, is the Commission recognizing there's a political opportunity here and outreaching to these big companies to say, let's establish a partnership together to make a difference for the future?
We do talk to on a regular basis with some of the big players. Some are more active, quite frankly, in reaching out. I think it also depends sometimes on where they're located in the world, where they have their plants, where they're exporting to, but they do come to see us on a regular basis, and we try to have a constructive dialogue to ensure that they are also reaching out to their suppliers and ensuring that we get the kind of support we need when the hard decisions need to be taken. So I don't accept the point Amanda made earlier that we are not following the scientific advice. We end up often as part of a compromise to reach decisions. And coming back to a particular example, when you have the combination of trying to reach, catch reductions and, as we've had for tropical tuna and ICAT, the pressure to allow additional fishing opportunities for developing countries, you're between a rock and a hard place. How do you strike the balance between those two? And if you want both at the same time, you're not going to get a solution. So you have to sometimes strike compromises. And that's the reality that we're faced with in these kinds of meetings. It doesn't mean that that's the best outcome possibly, but that is the reality we are faced with sometimes.
Well, we're winding up.
Can I make one comment on that?
So I'm going to come on to you, Camiel, by all means comment, but I'm going to come on to you anyway, so you can add this in, which is simply, I want a reflection on where we need to be going over the next 10 years. What role the MSC can be playing, how you can contribute, and I suppose, are you positive, are you optimistic or pessimistic?
Well, by nature, I'm an optimist. My glass is in principle half full, and I think this is a fixable problem. So I really believe we can fix it, but we just heard a very realistic observation that sometimes we strike a compromise. For me, a compromise is not good enough. And the reason is that you cannot compromise fish stocks endlessly. They will collapse. And so that is why I think what is really needed in terms of international ocean governance is some sort of mechanism that essentially is a quantitative allocation type of tool that mandates states that are having fleets targeting particular stocks to come to an agreement that allows fishing not exceeding scientific advice. That is ultimately what it comes down to. So, there's probably a big negotiation process that needs to happen first. Maybe a compromise can come out of that. But if we have a mechanism like that results in ultimately fishing mortality levels not exceeding what the recognized scientific bodies are advising in RFMOs and in other context, then we're on a good track. So linking this to the UN Ocean Conference, which is hopefully taking place later in the year in Lisbon. I'm not sure if that continues in the current COVID crisis, but if a process is started by the international community to at least start a dialogue to build that type of addendum to the international governance framework, that can result in something that is very, very needed in the context of climate change and secure fish stocks in the future.
Maybe I just throw this one out. You mentioned the Ocean Summit, which was planned for Lisbon, but because of the virus has been put back. What would be, Anders, what would be the European Union's ambitions when nations get together to discuss long-term ocean strategy? What would we have been doing at that summit?
That goes well beyond my mandate, I can tell you. So I can't give you the entire picture for the EU, because it's other parts of the DG MARE that is dealing with it. But I would, I think we would like to see the continued improvement in the performance of RFMOs. That's been one of the goals. It was also the goal in the ocean governance communications. We are, want to have the establishment. We have two particular targets in terms of upgrading existing RFMOs or regional fisheries bodies, WCAF and CCAF, which is off the west coast of Africa and in the Caribbean. So we want to, if you will, plug the holes in the governance framework that is there by upgrading existing RFMOs. And we'd love to see, as I said, one day an RFMO established for the Southwest Atlantic as well.
I take it you're optimistic about the future.
Yeah, I don't think you could do this job if you were not optimistic. You have to have the belief that you can achieve something and that we will get the results. But it's a challenge. And I said, in particular, at the moment where you have certain stocks that are under huge pressure, and you have the other factor is that you have, in particular, developing countries who see this as an opportunity to develop their fishing fleets for those stocks which are at the same time in decline. That is a very, very difficult problem to resolve.
I should just say that we've had a number of questions submitted during the course of the webinar, and we will have an extra half hour in which to just to consider those in a more relaxed style. But we're coming to an end here, and we just heard that last remark, Amanda. Any comments about that, about the current situation?
Oh, look, I share both of my learned colleagues' optimism here in terms of the fact that this is indeed a fixable problem. I remain, to return to your question at the beginning around the role of the EU, I remain concerned that the EU has a rosier view of its track record than is actually the case. And I really look forward to our and others' continued engagement with them toward their stated goals, as Anders has outlined today. But I think that the key to our optimism turning into success is that we take a really clear, hard look at how things are actually progressing and be prepared to take hard steps. So I very much enjoyed the conversation and look forward to further questions and share the optimism.
Well, thank you. And I'm sure you'll catch up in your sleep this morning back there in Washington. Well, team, next week, and please, the European Commission is expected next week to adopt its biodiversity strategy. Of course, we all know that the European Commission sometimes finds reason for delaying and putting things on the table. But if assuming it does, then the subject of our next Blue Deal debate in a fortnight's time will be biodiversity and its implications for the fishing industry if we're to impose all sorts of measures to try and ensure that we're not causing harm to life on this planet and beneath the waves. Obviously, big implications. We're looking forward, I hope, to the Director General of DG MARE joining us for that debate. So for the moment, let me just say thank you very much to Anders Jessen from the European Commission, to Amanda Nickson from Pew Charitable Trusts, from Camiel Derichs from the Marine Stewardship Council. You've all made the webinar possible, and I thank personally the team at Rood Pedersen, the consultancy in Brussels, who have also provided all these facilities and allowed this debate to take place. Now, our formal debate is coming to an end. Those of you who've enjoyed the discussion, who want to hear some of the questions that have been submitted and the answers that our panelists may wish to give, please stay around, make yourself another cup of coffee. This is sort of the end. You can turn off now if you wish, and I won't take offence. If you want to watch the debate again, I'm told simply press the registration button and it will become possible. Otherwise, it'll be on YouTube in a day or so. And if you want to be kept in the loop and register for future Blue Deal debates, then again, I told there's a button on the right-hand side which will allow you to do that, and you should certainly press it and register. I think what's already clear is that if we want sustainable policies, we need all sorts of people involved. We need the politicians involved, we need the NGOs involved, we need the industry involved. Closer dialogue between policymakers and environmentalists and industry, both catchers and fish processors. I hope we'll be able to develop that concept and put it into practice and encourage dialogue of this sort. Thank you very much indeed for those leaving us. Thank you for joining us. Hope you've enjoyed today's debate. Keep safe. Have a good day. That's it, but we still have, according to the figures, 159 people watching. And I've got a series of questions here. So you're all sitting back. You can be relaxed now, okay? It's a different session. We're not looking at the numbers, and we're conscious that we're in a different period. So I'm looking at some of the questions that have been fed through to me. And the first one is simply, I think, from Gillian Jackson here. It's about the ecology, really, perhaps to Anders. How do we ensure that we consider great impacts on the wider ecosystem, not just on the target commercial species? How do we ensure that the RFMO is protecting the species and the habitats? And I think this is of course in line with Sustainable Development Goal 14, is it not? It's not simply about protection of fish, it's protecting marine environments too. And how much does that come up at RFMOs? I mean, who does police the high seas and the fragile ecosystems and all that?
No, it is increasingly part of the discussion in the RFMOs. I mean, some of the more modern treaties establishing the RFMOs actually have it as a declared goal, but even those who don't have it as a specifically declared goal, if you look at the work of the scientific bodies in the RFMOs, they are dealing with ecosystem approach. Now, how to do it in practice is a lot easier said than actually done, but I mean, there's, every year there are scientific sub-bodies that look in some of the key RFMOs at how do we actually do this? How do we look at not just the target species, but the wider ecosystem impacts of the different activities? Some are more advanced than that work. I think ICAT on the one hand, and also NAFO, for example, have done a lot of good work in this area. So it is part of the conversation, and it is going to be so increasingly, I think, going forward. Okay.
Question maybe to Camiel, really, about for the MSc here. It's a little critical question, which is, although I mentioned that small fisheries are, perhaps attractive for brochures and such like, because they have an appeal. In practice, small-scale fisheries haven't got the money to go through the certification process that MSc might require. How do you make sure there's a level playing field there? How do you? Do you have special rates for small scale, and you make the big trawlers pay more, or what?
Well, let's first say the MSc doesn't charge in this process, in the sense that we don't assess if fisheries meet our standards or not. That's done by independent, accredited, third-party assessment bodies, and so it's hard to comment. Do we have separate charges or not? I don't think certification bodies, assessment bodies, charge separately for small-scale fisheries versus big fisheries. It's related to the complexity of the fishing operation, the number of stakeholder comments, and the process they have to work through. It is true that small-scale fisheries report, from a cost perspective, the MSc is a challenging standard to work with. But it's also a fact that in many cases, market support is available. So supply chain partners in many cases have helped smaller scale fisheries making improvements and even pick up part of the certification bills and annual surveillance audit bills. Then there is an incredible amount of donor money available for support, especially for small scale fisheries, to help these be assessed against independent
donor money. Where does the donor money come from? What's that?
So you have the Sustainable Fisheries Fund, for instance, which is a pot of money that comes out of, I believe, the Packard Foundation, originally in the US. We have an Ocean Stewardship Fund in the MSc itself. So the Ocean Stewardship Fund then allocates grants to fisheries that want to make improvements. And so even if that doesn't pay for certification, it does pay for some of the improvement work, like scientific research, and or maybe even testing new or different gears to avoid and mitigate impact across a whole range of different fisheries, many of them being small-scale fisheries in developing countries. Now, yes, there are cost barriers associated with credible certification, but there's also a lot of support mechanisms available. So I guess when it comes to the MSC, that is what we can refer to. The other things that we have done is we've evolved our standards over the years to accommodate for data poor fisheries. And very often small-scale fisheries find themselves targeting data poor stocks. Typically, it's not the most commercially attractive stocks and therefore having the biggest research budgets. And that means, nevertheless, these small-scale fisheries may be very sustainable, but they cannot demonstrate it with scientific analytical stock assessments. So what we have then developed is what we call a risk-based assessment framework for data poor fisheries to be assessed with. And many small-scale fisheries have benefited from that. Yeah, just a couple of examples.
Okay. Who's actually giving the money, though? I mean, is it coming from governments or private sources or fish processing companies, or who gives the money, these grants, effectively?
Yeah, it's a very diverse, what we hear is a very diverse number of donors. In certain cases, actually, the fishing industry, the small-scale fishing industry, getting organized itself in some sort of cooperative setting, whereby every member, every fishing vessel per kilo donates a small percentage into a funding pot to accommodate improvement. And then if that improvement work is finished, they make a joint decision whether or not they need to get certified against the MSC or not any other standard. But that's one example. In certain cases, actually the finance community might play a role. And we haven't really touched on that in the webinar today, but capital is fueling, I guess, the capacity to fish in many ways. The ability for fishing boats or processing lines and so forth. But the capital sector also has the ability to invest in sustainability, and it's increasingly aware in doing so.
Okay. So Anders, RFMO's question here from Alexandra Rodriguez. In your view, how can the EU improve its influence and leadership at international ocean governance level to promote level playing fields for all fisheries products coming into the EU market? And there's another question along similar lines, which is basically saying, come on, these RFMOs, they're really influenced by the big players, by the people with money, and doesn't that ultimately influence the decisions being taken?
Well, I think that is perhaps a historic view that doesn't reflect the reality of today. If you look at the RFMOs, which, by the way, is one of the reasons also it gets sometimes very difficult to take decisions, is that it is not enough for the big players just to agree and go to the meeting and say, we have an agreement and this is what we want to present to the rest of the membership. It doesn't work like that. You look at international organizations throughout the world, whether it's WTO or others, those days are gone. It is not enough that the EU and perhaps some of the other big ones get together and say, this is what we present to you, and then everybody else just endorse it. We have to spend enormous amount of energy trying to get sufficient support from everybody, and that's an additional challenge. But that's the nature of these organizations, that even some of the so-called smaller players also have a voice and are less afraid of using their voice and pushing their particular issues as well. So I don't think that's an assumption that's correct for today's world in the fisheries organizations. 10 years ago,
how big's
maybe.
You, by the way? When you say we have to do this, how big's your team? How many people have you got doing this?
I mean, for some of the RFMOs, we have 2 people that have to do compliance. They have to do all the subgroups. They have to do the scientific work, the compliance work, etc. For ICAT, we usually have a team about 10.
So this is the European team we're talking about here.
Maybe a team of 3 to 4. That's what we have for these kind of meetings. So as you can imagine, we are kept quite busy.
Yeah, okay. Right. What is, Dennis Fritsch, what is the Marine Stewardship Council doing to take into account, I'm not quite sure the question, how does it attribute verification data scientific advice? I'm not sure I understand the question. I suppose, I mean, you take into, general question for you, Camiel, how do you take into account scientific advice? Do you have to get specialist scientific advice for, if for a particular fishery over and above what may exist at the present time? And
so I think I'd just give an example in what an assessment team is doing. So when a fishery wants to be assessed against the MSC standard first, it publicly announces that it wants to be assessed, and then a team of evaluators is constructed, and that team of evaluators will look at the available scientific evidence to assess the fishery with, and it will also invite stakeholders to submit whatever information they have on the fishery. In Europe, typically ICES is the science body that recommends the Fisheries Administration, and that's also the basis for the assessment teams to look at. So if you have, say, a stock of herring in the North Sea, the North Sea herring advice being issued in May of every year, that is then the basis for the assessment team to look at if a herring fishery were to be assessed against the MSC standard. I think that's the easiest answer. And then, of course, that's just a stock assessment. There's a whole lot more that the assessors check. They look at compliance reports. They speak to the NGOs, to individual scientists to look at the data quality is good and if the monitoring programs functions. They may look at all sorts of additional, say, information sources to come to their conclusions on the various parts of the standards. And if you want to be engaged in that, again, it's public. As a stakeholder, you are very welcome to participate in that process.
Amanda, let me throw that. There's a question here which is criticizing the EU and saying, how can we reconcile the ambition to be leaders globally in promoting sustainability with our own track record back in the EU? Well, how do you? I mean, we dealt with this 2 weeks ago, and the point was being made actually that great progress has been made by the EU in promoting sustainability in its own waters over the past 10 years. Still some way to go, to put it mildly, especially in the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, which are disaster zones still. But what's your general feeling about the EU and its fisheries policies these days? Are we on the side of the angels or rather not?
I think the intention is to be on the side of the angels. I think the practicality of that is something a bit different. And I think that there are certainly very real challenges, as Anders has outlined, with respect to balancing a range of interests. But I think what's more important at this stage is to look forward and say, how could we actually go forward? And I'd offer a couple of points on this. One is that it is a common what's what I'm looking for? Game that people like to play that's called let's get really angry about how bad the RFMOs are. And I think if you look at the last 10 years of changes in RFMOs from not discussing harvest strategies or sharks or anything to now, that we've seen significant improvements over that period of time. And when you consider the size of the teams that meet each year, the multiple language groups, everything else, I think we are seeing a slow march in that direction. What I would love to see, and I think what many of my NGO colleagues would like to see from the European Union, is a much greater level of out-of-the-gate leadership that's in line with what they've agreed in the CFP to do in international waters. And one really critical example I'd offer around that is that it's very hard for other countries and players in an RFMO to consider the European Union wants to be a leader on these issues when you look at something like Mako sharks, where Europe's delegation actively argued to allow fishing in a situation where the scientific advice said no retention was the necessary step forward. And I think the real challenge for the EU going forward is going to be to balance its leadership desires with and really enact those in a way that we can see them moving forward in RFMOs, because I don't think it's as simple as listen to the big players anymore. I think there is a need for the larger players to really, really enact that leadership. And I'm talking not only about the EU in this regard, because the EU isn't the only large player in the room that needs to do that. But I think when we look at that, second is I would really love to see the EU take a wider focus to its stakeholder input, not only in the delegation, but in the lead up to that, so that we're not seeing what looks to be a predominantly industry-led position. And thirdly would be to continue their much valued and supported funding and work towards improved science and harvest strategies. So it would be inappropriate to leave this, in a sense, in any way that doesn't acknowledge the significant investment the EU has made in that regard. It just can't be seen as the only marker of success.
Chris, can I react to that?
Yeah, please, Anders. I thought you would.
Because I'm glad Amanda brought up the example of short fin mako, and sorry for the pun, but it is still a bit of a red herring, because the position of the EU was driven by science, not by industrial interests when we took the position. And we've explained that on many occasions, including to your colleagues from Pew. The key question was, and the scientists, by the way, explicitly admitted that in the annual meeting, that instead, for the first of all, in giving the managers, which is the usual way you give scientific advice, is giving managers options. They didn't give managers an option. They also admitted that the advice they had given had no conservation value. The fact of throwing away dead fish, which is a waste, was not did not have any conservation value. So that was the basis for the scientific advice. What the EU was trying to do was trying to address the real problem, which is the mortality associated with bycatch of short fin mako. And the way to do that is to find improving the activities of the fishing fleets involved. And there is a trade-off. If you want them to cooperate with you and bring the bycatch down, you could, and that was the proposal we had, do a combination of the two. You would reduce dramatically the amount that was allowed to be retained, but instead of throwing them away, you would allow, provided they had observers on board and a number of other conditions, you would, and that was the best chance you would have for getting the mortality levels down, which would address the core problem. Yeah. Because you're not going to save the dead shark by throwing it back in the ocean. It is already dead. You need to bring the numbers down that die in the first place.
I think you argue, it's a fair case in the environment of the ICAT meeting. But I mean, I was at that meeting, the last meeting, as you know, and I knew nothing about the mako shark when I got there. But when you hear that, even if we stop catching makos completely, it'll take till 2070 for stocks to recover. Then you get an idea that here's a stock that's on the edge of complete collapse and potential extinction of a species. And then surely the danger here is that, despite your arguments, which, as I say, makes a good compromise case, there's a real risk that we just simply assume that mako is being caught as a bycatch, almost as an accident, whereas there's some evidence that in practice, the fishermen would not be able to survive economically, Spanish fishermen and the like, going out there if they weren't catching mako. So, the argument it's a bycatch is not really true. People are going out there hunting it.
But that's why you need observers on board, and that was the condition for being able to retain them. You could only do it if you had observers on board. So there is the compromise you need to do in order to get the mortality levels down. The idea that if you impose on fishermen the obligation to throw away the dead fish, they will make additional efforts to keep these fish alive is not based on reality. That's not the way the business operates. They're going to look for the quickest way to discard the fish with mortality levels, if anything, going up. We want to bring the mortality levels down. We want to make sure that the live fish that are brought alongside are released, and we want to increase the number of the live fish that are released. And that's the strategy for doing it. It's not just throwing away dead fish. That's not going to get you to where you need to go.
Okay, move on. Amanda, can I just throw, you can come back if you like, but I want to throw a question at you. You've referred to harvest-based strategies a couple of times. What are harvest-based strategies?
I will happily come on to that. I'll just point out that I understand the trade-off that Anders is talking about, but the EU has known about mako for decades. There has been information about the decline of this stock. It should never have got to this point where we're actually looking at scientific advice saying, even with zero fisheries-based mortality. So this notion that somehow at this point this was a reasonable and acceptable response ignores the years and years of advice saying otherwise. On harvest strategies.
Amanda, just on that point, there was only advice on 2017 or 2018 from the ICAT scientific body. So you're again referring to advice elsewhere. We followed the advice of the official bodies, not going around shopping for advice wherever it's available.
I respectfully disagree that any advice was followed when mortality is actually being allowed to continue in the face of information that says that will lead to no reduction in risk to the stock for quite some time. That is just simply not in line with scientific advice, and I respectfully disagree.
Isn't it?
Yeah, far beyond the precautionary principle. On the issue of harvest strategies are fundamentally, we think, the way forward for all stakeholders involved in fisheries management, because what they essentially do is say, let's construct the rules of the game, if you will, before we go in the water. Let's bring industry and civil society and government representatives and everyone who has a stake in this to the table to discuss what the management objectives of the fishery should be. Then develop a model that a computer simulation essentially that functions the way the fishery might based on the best available information. And then you look at different management regimes and you test them with that simulation so that what you then decide on as a group has the best chance of meeting those objectives. And the objectives don't have to be the highest catches possible every year, and they don't have to be the minimum catches possible every year. They can be objectives around sustainability and stock status. The reason we think that this is so important, as close to a magic bullet as you can get, and gives rise certainly to the optimism that we expressed at the end of the last session, is it brings all of your stakeholders together, not just industry, not just civil society, not just the government representatives that may be caught in the middle. It brings all of those interests to the table and determines a roadmap for managing the fishery that is in line with agreed objectives. It takes it away from the annual quota fight because it becomes a multi-year system. You can review it on a regular basis, and over time you can allow catches to continue and increase even while in a situation where you're looking at recovery of depleted stocks. It's a highly logical approach. The downside, which I'm sure anyone involved in this would tell you, is it's long. It requires a significant willingness to engage. It's heavy on scientific input to get it to the point where you need it to work. But our view is, when you're talking about the health of the oceans and everything in it, 70% of the planet, it's a relatively small lift for the outcome it can deliver. And it results in basically...
I know this is... I'm indulging myself here in exploring this. And this, right. I don't really hear anyone in the EU talk. I hear us talking about the ecosystem-based approach. Is that the same thing? I mean, but I still don't see actually how we apply the ecosystem-based approach rather than simply, take the scientific evidence each year and set quotas.
No, I think, as I said, it's a complicated process, and when we are talking about, let me just, because I agreed with actually for the first time with much of what Amanda was saying on the harvest control strategies and the way forward. I mean, the upfront investment, both to get ecosystem right and to get harvest control right, is enormous, and I think there has unfortunately been, including, I think, from our own side, a bit of an underestimation of the actual work that goes into getting these harvest control strategies done properly. And I'm sure the more we put in place, the better we become at doing it. But the first couple of times you do it, it's a huge, huge lift. And that is, I think, has meant, and I think we were, for example, in ICAT, there was, and I think the realization is it's simply too much to ask for. There were 3 harvest control processes intended to go on in parallel, and the organization, even as big as ICAT, couldn't handle it. They couldn't handle it, neither the scientists nor could the managers, because there was simply too much information and too much to process in one go. So we have to start maybe slightly slower, but I assume as we have done a couple of them, we'll get better and better and at doing it, because everybody will be more familiar with it. The other challenge is then, how do you get the process and the dialogue going between the scientists and the managers, because that's an important part of the process as well. Do the managers, when they're presented with these huge, complicated mathematical models, actually understand what it is they're deciding? Because once they put the scheme in place, the idea is, of course, managers, we take a step back, and it's not going to be sort of a methodology where you just put in the scientific advice and it spits out a result, but almost. I mean, you would have much clearer parameters what the outcome would be once you have the scientific advice. But there's an interplay between us managers and the scientists, and that is a challenge. Some countries, again, are probably better equipped because they have more scientific capacities. Others, it's a challenge because they are struggling to have the right kind of scientists, the right kind of people there at the right time.
Got a question here from Kevin Stead, referring to the recent COP15 resolution, presumably by the Parliament, calling for, well, as we know, we should be seeking to establish some 30% of the global ocean floor should be become a marine protected area of one kind or another. At an RFMO level in the high seas, is anything being done to promote greater protection? Is it RFMOs that deal with this, Anders? Or is it
Yes,
other levels?
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you very, very concrete examples. I think, in fact, Amanda spoke on it before I came on in the beginning. So Camiel, so in the Antarctic, there is already one marine protected area that's been established, and the EU is one of the key promoters of establishing 2 additional marine protected areas. We have 2 countries that have been blocking progress, and we're working very hard to try to get these 2 last countries to come on board so we can establish
these countries are which countries?
China and Russia.
Great.
So we have a bit of a challenge there, but we've been working quite hard at trying to get these 2 countries to come on board with the rest, because there is overall decisions about the level of percentage that we need to establish across the globe, and Camiel seems to be the obvious place where you should do it, and so we hope we can count on the other proponents who have been helping us with this to persuade the 2 last countries to come on board with the rest of the supporters.
One last question to all of you, really, just it's about the virus. Is in terms of promoting sustainability, in terms of trying to manage overfishing, in terms of generally improving certification and the like, are the economic consequences of the virus going to affect things negatively? Or is it too early to say?
I think it's clear, certainly from the people that I speak to in both industry and NGOs, that it is having a profound effect in supply chain, in the area of supply chain from match to market, certainly. Second, the big one that we've certainly noticed is the ongoing moves to try and remove observers from vessels, because obviously you want to do everything you can to keep humans safe at this time. And so certainly that leaves us with concerns about oversight of those fisheries. We also think, to return to our previous discussion on optimism, that it creates a real opportunity to move forward with electronic monitoring and reporting more fully, in a way that we think is going to be fundamentally useful to transparency and oversight of fisheries going forward. And frankly, if it had to happen, there is absolutely no better time, because from an electronic monitoring and reporting perspective, because we have the technology available to us in this day and age, and to a greater degree than we previously did. So I think that it's going to be particularly hard for industry to secure their supply chain for a while. And I speak to that from an expert perspective any more than to note that. But certainly from the perspective of the catching sector, the opportunity to get electronic monitoring and reporting is one that we should all grasp and move forward with.
Camiel,
Can I add to that?
Quick, and Anders, if you like, yes, just a quick 30-second comment, please.
Yeah, no, just to say that, I agree very much with the point that Amanda made about the electronic monitoring, but we've been quite busy and also the fact that there's going to be a significant impact on the sector. But what we've been concerned about and been working very hard is that we don't simply throw our hands up in the air and allow uncontrolled fisheries to take place. So we've been in discussion with a number of third countries to try to establish minimum common principles that ensures that there is good effort being made to, for example, on regional observers, to ensure that regional observers are deployed whenever possible. It may not be possible all the time, but there's an effort because there may be some who immediately jump to the conclusion just saying, let's derogate from all the rules and just go about our fishing with no control. That's not what we want to see. We want to be cautious and do whatever is possible in these difficult circumstances to ensure that there's a minimum degree of control, and that these cases will afterwards be examined, for example, in the compliance committees, to ensure that there was no abuse of this period.
Camiel, quick last word.
Quick last word. Profound impacts is what we observe on MSC certified fisheries, with especially the smaller scale fisheries being impacted very heavily. Restaurants, hotels are closed, fresh markets typically have effect. So that is happening. At the same time, we do believe this is a good time to look at improving fisheries compliance measures. We've heard electronic monitoring as an opportunity. We're currently reviewing the fisheries standard. We have a fisheries standard review ongoing in which also this part of the MSC program is up for discussion and potentially change, where new best practices on monitoring, compliance and surveillance may be embedded in the future standard. We'll see what comes out of the process. Stakeholders can participate. Last thing for me is then on consumers. In terms of sustainability, our recent polls show that sustainability is more important than ever. In this context of COVID, I think people are more reflective of potentially doing things a bit different in the future and living even more consciously in harmony with the environment. So sustainability is not a trend, it's there to stay.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed. I'm sorry to those of you who've not had your questions answered, or indeed put to our panelists. I want to thank the three of you. I want to thank Anders Jessen in Brussels from the. You are in Brussels, Anders?
Yeah, in Brussels. Yes.
Yeah, in Brussels from the European Commission. I want to thank Amanda Nickson in Washington from Pew Charitable Trusts, and I want to thank Camiel Derichs in Finland from the Marine Stewardship Council. Thanks very much. I hope, Anders, you did know that Amanda said a lot of nice things about you, as well as saying you should be doing more.
That must have been in the beginning before I was on, I think. But I look forward to Pew signing up as part of our delegation this year. That would be a news.
Excellent.
You'll have to watch the replay.
Wonderful.
When you're feeling a little less sensitive, and you'll find lots of nice things.
Yeah.
So, thank you very much indeed. I hope
you.
the Commission adopts the biodiversity strategy next week, in which case our fortnightly Blue Deal debate in 2 weeks' time will be about biodiversity and the effects upon the fishing industry. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.